Welcome to Forgotten Fronts, Warfare Across the Ages. I'm your host, and here we explore the battles, leaders, and strategies that shaped our world. From ancient empires to modern conflict, we break down how warfare forged power, redrew borders, and changed history. Welcome to the front lines. I feel the need to start this episode off with you guys as just like a preface that this is the second time I am having to record this because my laptop crashed. It is currently 9 o'clock at night, so I do have to do this rather quietly, so it may not be as dramatic or anything like that. I apologize. But let's get into this because there are certain stories in history that the moment you hear them, you just kind of stop for a second and think, wait, how have I never heard about this? And that's exactly how I felt the first time I learned about the Night Witches. And the more I read about them, the more unbelievable the whole thing started to sound. I mean, imagine being a German soldier on the Eastern Front in the middle of the night. It's dark, it's quiet, the war has already been brutal, and suddenly you start hearing this faint whooshing sound in the sky. It's not engines, it's not heavy bombers, it's just this soft, gliding sound above you. And then bombs start falling out of the darkness. That's the part that has truly stuck with me, because these pilots weren't flying modern bombers. They weren't flying fast aircraft with heavy armor or powerful engines. These women were flying wooden biplanes that were already considered outdated before this war had even started. They were slow planes, they were fragile, and they were planes that could barely outrun anything in the sky. And yet, somehow, these women became one of the most feared units in the Eastern Front. German soldiers actually gave them the nickname Night Witches because of the sound their planes made when they cut their engines and glided silently towards their targets. The Germans said it sounded like witches' brooms sweeping through the night. And the craziest part, these weren't just a handful of pilots. This was an entire regiment made up of women. Women flying combat missions night after night in freezing temperatures with minimal equipment against one of the most powerful armies in the world. And the deeper I looked into their story, the more I realized this truly wasn't just a story about aviation or tactics. It's a story about determination, about proving people wrong, and about a group of pilots who were told they didn't belong in combat, and then went on to fly tens of thousands of missions during World War II. And honestly, the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this is exactly the kind of story Forgotten Fronts is meant to explore. Because everyone knows about the big battles of World War II, but stories like this, stories about people who fought in ways that history doesn't always highlight, those are the stories that deserve a closer look. So today we're stepping into the skies of the Eastern Front during World War II to understand who these pilots were, how they became one of the most unusual bombing units in military history, and how a group of young women flying outdated aircraft became a nightmare for German forces at night. So, my friends, let's step back into time. To understand how the Night Witches came to exist, we do have to go back to the summer of 1941, June 22nd of 1941 to be exact. Germany launches Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union. Millions of German troops pour across the border. Armored divisions roll east, aircraft strike Soviet airfields, and within weeks, entire Soviet armies are collapsing. Cities fall, airfields burn, and the Red Army is suddenly fighting for survival. The scale of the invasion is almost impossible to imagine. It is the largest military operation in human history. And for the Soviet Union, the early months of the war were completely catastrophic. The Soviet Air Force loses thousands of aircrafts in the first days of the invasion. Many of them are destroyed on the ground before they even had a chance to take off. Pilots were killed and airfields were overrun and entire units just vanish. The country is desperate for anything that can help slow the German advance. And during this chaos, something unusual begins to happen. Young women across the Soviet Union start volunteering for combat aviation. Some of them had been pilots before the war, and others had trained through civilian aviation clubs. Many of these women were teenagers who had grown up fascinated with flight. But there was a problem. At the time, women were not widely accepted in aviation combat with the Soviet Union. Even in the Soviet Union, which at the time promoted the idea of equality in many areas, the military was still largely dominated by men. Most commanders simply didn't believe women belonged in combat aircraft. But one person did, and her name was Marina Reskova. Reskova was already famous throughout the Soviet Union. She was one of the country's most celebrated aviators, a navigator and pilot who had set long-distance flight records in the late 1930s. Newspapers called her the Soviet Amelia Earhart. She was a national hero. And when the war began, thousands of young women wrote letters asking how they could serve as pilots. Those letters began arriving on Reskova's desk. Instead of dismissing them, she brought the idea directly to Soviet leadership. She argued that if the country was fighting for survival, it couldn't afford to ignore trained pilots simply because they were women. That argument reached Joseph Stalin, and surprisingly enough, he agreed. In October of 1941, the Soviet Union authorized the creation of 3 all-female aviation regiments: the 586th Fighter Aviation Regiment, the 587th Bomber Aviation Regiment, and the one that would become simply legendary, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. This regiment would be tasked with flying harassment bombing missions at night, attacking German positions under cover of darkness. At first glance, it did not sound like a glamorous assignment. The aircraft they were given were small training planes, wood and canvas biplanes, with open cockpits, no armor, no radar, and no radio in many of these cases. And yet, these aircraft would soon become the tool that made the Night Witches famous. Before they could fly combat missions, these women had to become soldiers first, and that training would push them to their limits. Their training was not easy. In fact, it was rushed, intense, and happening at a moment when the Soviet Union was already under enormous pressure. The women selected for the 588th Night Bomber Regiment arrived at Ingalls Air Base in late 1941. Many of them were barely out of school, and some were still teenagers. Most were in their late teens or early 20s. But suddenly, they were being asked to become military pilots in the middle of the largest war the world had ever seen. The training schedule was honestly brutal. Pilots, navigators, mechanics, and ground crews were all trained at the same time. Their days were long and their nights were even longer. Everyone was expected to learn quickly because the front lines were already burning across the Soviet Union. But the challenge wasn't just learning to fly combat missions. It was learning to do it with the aircraft they were given. The plane assigned to the 588th Night Bomber Regiment was the Polikarpov POD-2. And even by the standards of the early 1940s, the POD-2 was outdated. It had originally been designed in the late 1920s as a training aircraft. The frame was made of mostly wood, the wings were covered in fabric, the cockpit was open to the air. There was no armor plating to protect the crew, no modern targeting systems, no advanced instruments, and perhaps most dangerously of all, this plane was slow. And I don't just mean slow, I mean very slow. At full speed, the POD-2 could only reach about 150 kilometers per hour. That meant that almost any German fighter aircraft could catch it easily. The POD-2 also carried a very small bomb load, usually just 2 bombs at a time. Compared to the massive bombers flying over Europe, it looked almost laughable. But what the POD-2 lacked in speed, armor, and firepower, it made up for something that was completely unexpected. It made up for it with control. The aircraft was incredibly maneuverable at low speeds. It could fly very slowly without stalling. It could operate from rough airfields, and perhaps most importantly, it could fly quietly. The quietness would become the defining element of the Night Witch's tactics, because these pilots quickly learned that trying to fight the Germans with speed or firepower was absolutely impossible. Their planes simply were not built for that. So instead, they turned their weaknesses into advantages. They flew at night, and they flew low, and they flew slowly. And when they approached their targets, they would often cut their engines completely. The plane would glide silently through the darkness toward the ground. From below, German soldiers would hear only the faint sound of wind moving across the wings, a soft rushing noise, like a broom sweeping through the air. That sound became legendary among German troops, because when they heard it, they knew bombs were about to fall. The Germans began calling the pilots Nachthexen, night witches. What started as a nickname meant to mock them soon became a title that carried real fear and terror, because these small, fragile aircrafts kept appearing night after night, dropping bombs and then disappearing into the darkness and refusing to stop. Once the Night Witches began flying combat missions, they quickly developed tactics that were perfectly suited to the aircraft they were flying. Because the truth was simple: if they tried to fight the war the same way other bomber units did, they would simply be destroyed. The Peyote-2 was too slow to outrun German fighters. It had no armor to survive heavy anti-aircraft fire, and the aircraft could only carry a small number of bombs at a time. So instead of flying large bombing raids like traditional bomber units, the Night Witches operated very differently. Their missions focused on harassment bombing. The goal wasn't to destroy massive industrial targets or cities. The goal was to keep German focus constantly under pressure. Night after night and hour after hour and minute after minute, the pilots would take off after sunset. Their targets were often German supply depots, artillery positions, troop camps, bridges, and ammunition stores. Anything that could disrupt German operations, but reaching those targets required flying into heavily defended territory. German positions were often protected by searchlights and anti-aircraft guns. If a Peyote-2 was caught in the beams of a searchlight, it became an easy target. German fighter pilots quickly realized that even though the aircraft was slow, they could still shoot them down. So the Night Witches had to rely on their stealth. As they approached their target area, the pilots would reduce power to their engines. Sometimes they would shut the entire engines off entirely. The aircraft would then glide silently through the darkness toward the target. With the engine off, the only sound was the wind rushing across the wings. From the ground, German soldiers would hear that eerie sweeping sound growing closer and closer. Then, suddenly, the bombs would fall. The pilots would restart their engines and disappear into the darkness before defenders could react. But because each aircraft carried such a small bomb load, the Night Witches had to repeat the process over and over again. A single crew might fly multiple missions in one night, sometimes 8, sometimes 10, and sometimes even more. They would land, rearm, refuel, and take off again almost immediately. Ground crews worked in freezing temperatures to prepare the aircraft for the next flight. Mechanics patched bullet holes, bombs were loaded by hand, fuel lines were checked. Then the pilots would climb back into the open cockpit and return to the night sky. The conditions were brutal. The cockpits were open to the wind. Winter temperatures on the Eastern Front could drop far below freezing. Pilots often wrapped themselves in layers of clothing just to survive the cold. But even that wasn't always enough. The combination of wind, darkness, and constant flying pushed the pilots to their limits. And yet, the Night Witches kept flying, night after night, and mission after mission, until their presence became a constant problem for German forces. German soldiers began to dread the night, because when darkness fell, the night witches would eventually arrive, and once they did, sleep was impossible. Behind the legend of the night witches were the women who actually flew those missions. And when you start looking at their lives, something becomes clear very quickly. Most of them were incredibly young. Many of the pilots and navigators in the 588th Night Bomber Regiment were in their late teens or early 20s when they arrived at training. Some had been flying before the war through Soviet aviation clubs. Others had dreamed about flying for years, but had never imagined that dream would turn into combat missions during a global war. When they arrived at Engels Air Base, they were suddenly thrown into a completely different world. They weren't just learning how to fly. They were learning how to survive in a war. The regiment was made up almost entirely of women, pilots, navigators, mechanics, ground crews. But even though the regiment was officially created as an all-female unit, the environment around them was not always supportive. Some male officers initially doubted them. There were people who believed women couldn't handle combat aviation. Others assumed the unit wouldn't last long once it reached the front. The women of the 588th knew this. They understood that every mission they flew wasn't just about fighting the enemy. It was about proving that they belonged there. And inside the regiment, a strong sense of camaraderie began to form. Pilots and navigators worked in pairs. The pilot controlled the aircraft, the navigator handled the map, the target, and the bomb release. They depended on each other completely. At night, in the darkness, often flying through anti-aircraft fire. Those partnerships became incredibly close. Many crews flew together for dozens, sometimes hundreds of missions. They trusted each other with their lives. Their life on the ground was still just as difficult. Airfields were often rough and temporary. Supplies were limited. The women sometimes had to modify their uniforms themselves because standard equipment didn't always fit them properly. In the early months of the regiment, they didn't even have proper flight gear designed for women. Some pilots flew wearing oversized boots and jackets meant for male aviators, and despite the danger of their missions, the women still found ways to maintain small pieces of normal life. They joked with each other, they shared stories, they supported each other after difficult missions. Combat aviation created a unique kind of stress. Every takeoff carried the possibility that someone might not return. German fighters sometimes hunted the slow POD-2 aircrafts. Anti-aircraft guns could tear through the fragile wood and fabric planes. Searchlights could trap a crew in the sky with nowhere to hide. And when a crew didn't come back, the loss was felt across the entire regiment. But instead of breaking their resolve, those losses often strengthened it. The pilots understood exactly what they were risking, and they kept flying anyway, because for them, the mission was bigger than fear. They weren't just pilots anymore. They had become a combat unit, one that would soon build a reputation across the Eastern Front, a reputation that German forces would come to respect and fear. As the war continued, the Night Witches found themselves flying deeper and deeper into the most dangerous parts of the Eastern Front. The German army had pushed far into Soviet territory in the early years of the war. Cities were destroyed, entire regions were under occupation, and every mile of ground that the Red Army tried to reclaim came at such an enormous cost. For the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, this meant their missions were becoming more frequent and more dangerous, because German commanders had started to take them seriously. At first, the Night Witches had been dismissed as an annoyance, a small nuisance flying outdated training aircraft. But over time, German units realized something important. These pilots weren't going away. They were flying every night, and their attacks were disrupting supply lines, damaging equipment, and keeping troops constantly on edge. So German forces began adapting. Anti-aircraft defenses were strengthened around key positions. Searchlights were deployed to sweep the skies. Fighter pilots were instructed to hunt the slow biplanes. For the Night Witches, this changed the nature of their missions. Flying slowly through the darkness had once given them a certain advantage, but now German defenses were actively looking for them. Searchlights would suddenly flare to life across the battlefield, scanning the sky for aircraft. If a P-82 was caught in the beam, the result could and would be devastating. Anti-aircraft guns would open fire almost immediately. The fragile wooden aircraft offered pretty much no protection, and a few well-placed shells could rip through the wings or the engine. Sometimes the pilots had only seconds to react. The only real defense the Night Witches had was maneuverability. The P-82 could turn sharply at low speeds. It could dip and weave through the darkness in ways heavier aircraft could not. Pilots would throw their planes into sudden dives or tight turns to escape the beams of searchlights. Other times, they relied on something even simpler, which was the darkness. Night missions meant limited visibility for everyone involved, attackers and defenders alike. But darkness could also be disorienting. Navigators had to read maps and identify landmarks in near total darkness while the aircraft bounced through the cold air. A small mistake could send them off course, or worse, it could send them directly into the German defenses. And the conditions in the cockpit made everything harder. Because the P-82 had an open cockpit, there was no enclosed canopy protecting the crew from the wind. At altitude, the cold would just feel worse and be so much more brutal. Pilots sometimes flew in temperatures far below freezing, with wind that would cut through their clothing as they gripped the controls. Ice would be forming on the equipment and their hands would go numb. But despite all of that, the missions continued, night after night. The regiment flew thousands of sorties across the war. Many of the pilots accumulated hundreds of combat missions. Some flew more than 1,000, and while losses did occur, as they do in any war, the Night Witches proved something remarkable. These fragile aircraft and their determined crews were capable of surviving in one of the most brutal air wars in history, not because they had the best equipment, but because they had learned how to fight in a way their enemy didn't expect. And over time, their persistence turned them into something more than just another bombing unit. They became a symbol of relentless pressure, a constant reminder to the German forces that even when the sun went down, the war was not stopping. By the middle years of World War II, the Night Witches had become something more than just another Soviet aviation unit. They had become a legend. Across the Eastern Front, German soldiers had started talking about the small biplanes that appeared almost every night. At first, it had been confusing. The aircraft were slow, they looked outdated, and compared to the large bombers flying across Europe, they seemed almost insignificant. But night after night, those same planes kept coming back, dropping bombs, disrupting supply lines, keeping German troops awake. And most importantly, it was reminding them that nowhere was truly safe after dark. That constant pressure had a psychological impact. German soldiers began to dread the sound of those aircraft approaching, the quiet gliding sound that came just before the bombs fell. It was that sound that led to the nickname Die Nachthexen, or the Night Witches. The name came from the German troops themselves. They said the gliding aircraft sounded like witches flying on broomsticks through the night sky. The nickname was meant to mock them in the beginning, but over time it became something closer to respect, because die Nachthexen weren't going away. By the end of the war, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment had flown more than 20,000 combat missions. Some crews flew hundreds of sorties. Several pilots flew over 1,000 missions. For comparison, many fighter pilots during World War II considered 50 or 100 combat missions to be an intense operational career. But the Night Witches flew night after night, landing, reloading, taking off again, sometimes multiple times in a single evening. Their aircraft remained the same simple POD-2 biplanes for most of the war, but by that point the aircraft had almost become part of their identity. It was small, it was light, it was quiet, and it was surprisingly effective. The regiment also produced several decorated pilots. More than 20 members of the unit were eventually awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union, one of the highest honors in the country. And perhaps just as important as the combat record was the example they set. At a time when many militaries still refused to allow women in combat roles, the Night Witches had proven something undeniable. They had proven the skill, the discipline, the courage, and those things had nothing to do with gender. They had everything to do with determination and training. By the final years of the war, the Night Witches were no longer seen as an experiment. They were veterans, experienced combat aviators who had survived years of night warfare. And when the war finally began turning against Germany, their missions continued, because even as Soviet forces advanced westward, the night sky remained their battlefield. And the sound of those quiet aircraft still carried a warning for anyone on the ground below. Die Nachthexen were coming. When we look back on the story of the Night Witches today, it's easy to focus on the most dramatic parts of the story. The wooden planes, the silent gliding attacks, the image of pilots flying through the freezing night sky while anti-aircraft fire lit up the darkness below. Those parts of the story are powerful, but the real lessons from the Night Witches go deeper than that. The first lesson is something we see again and again throughout military history. Technology matters, but how you use it matters even more. The POD-2 was not an advanced aircraft. It was slow, it was fragile, and it carried only a small number of bombs. But yet, the pilots of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment found a way to turn that aircraft into an effective weapon. They leaned into what the plane could do well. It had great low-speed control, short takeoffs, quiet flight. They used that instead of trying to compete with faster bombers or fighters. They developed tactics built around stealth and persistence. They flew at night. They approached slowly. They cut their engines and glided toward their targets. In many ways, they turned their greatest weakness into their greatest advantage. The second lesson is about pressure. Not the kind of pressure that wins a single battle, the kind that wears an enemy down over time. The Night Witches didn't destroy entire cities or massive industrial targets. Their missions were small. Short bombing runs against camps, supply areas, and artillery positions. But they did it over and over again, night after night. And that constant presence meant German soldiers rarely felt safe once darkness fell. They lost sleep. They stayed on alert, and they never knew when another small aircraft might glide silently overhead. Sometimes warfare isn't about overwhelming force. Sometimes it's about persistence. And the Night Witches were incredibly persistent. The third lesson comes from the people themselves. These pilots were not expected to succeed. When the all-female aviation regiments were first created, many people assumed that this experiment would fail. Combat aviation was seen as too dangerous, too demanding, too intense. But the pilots of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment proved that assumption wrong. Through training, through discipline, and through sheer determination, they became one of the most active bombing units on the Eastern Front. They flew thousands of missions, and they survived years of war, and they left behind a reputation that still fascinates historians today. The story of the Night Witches reminds us that warfare isn't only shaped by massive armies or advanced machines. It's also shaped by individuals, by the decisions they make, by the risks they're willing to take, and by the determination they bring to the fight. Sometimes the most powerful weapon on a battlefield isn't technology. Sometimes the most powerful weapon on a battlefield is resolve. Seriously, when I first learned about the Night Witches, I kept coming back to the same thought. Imagine being in that cockpit in the middle of the night. There's almost no light except for the moon and whatever fires might be burning on the ground below. You're sitting in that open cockpit with freezing air rushing past you. Your plane is made mostly of wood and fabric. There's no armor protecting you, no advanced instruments, and no radar telling you where the danger might be. And somewhere out there in the darkness are searchlights, anti-aircraft guns, and fighter pilots who would love to shoot you down. And yet, you take off anyway. That's the part of this story that sticks with me the most. Because when we talk about World War II, the conversation usually focuses on the massive armies, the huge battles, and enormous machines of war, like tanks and battleships and strategic bombers. But the Night Witches remind us that war is also made up of individuals. Young people, many of them barely in their 20s, climbing into aircraft and flying directly into danger because their country needed them to. And what's fascinating about the Night Witches is that they didn't win attention by flying the fastest planes or dropping the biggest bombs. They built their reputation through persistence, through showing up night after night, mission after mission, even when the conditions were miserable, even when the odds weren't in their favor. And I think that's why their story has lasted. Because it's not just a story about aviation or military tactics. It's a story about determination, about proving people wrong, about a group of pilots who were told they didn't belong in combat and then went on to become one of the most recognizable aviation units of the war. And honestly, that's exactly the kind of story that fits so perfectly with what Forgotten Fronts is all about. Because history remembers the biggest battles, but sometimes, just sometimes, the most fascinating stories are the ones happening quietly in the background, in places most people never think to look. Stories like the Night Witches, pilots flying wooden planes through the darkness, changing the rhythm of war one mission at a time. Thank you guys for bearing with this one. It was a hard re-record. But I seriously thank you guys for taking the time to listen to Forgotten Fronts Warfare Across the Ages. This is a podcast of passion for me, and I just appreciate it so much. So, until next time, I will see you on the front lines.